So let's see. Today we are ready to start talking about taxes. We also talk about Toxic Substances Control Act, other government agencies, EPA in particular, and if time allows, we'll also discuss classification question related to the importation of merchandise, specifically garments. Chapter 61-62. So let's dive in and see what happens. So a note about taxes. So first thing I'd like to start off is what's called is excise tax, and specifically the whiskey tax rebellion, which came into the history of our country as very first tax, first founded in 1971, and it was made by the government, by the early government of our republic, of United States Republic, and it didn't go too well. And as you can see, this is official TTB, Tobacco Trade Bureau government site, which is responsible for collection, and it pretty much describes how the tax was imposed to recover, as an early effort to recover, to raise revenues to pay for the war, which was done in the name of independence, and also to make sure to make sure that the debts are paid, and it also came as a test as one of the first tests for the United States to see how unified the country is. So basically, it didn't go too well because a lot of historians label this as one where you have one of the first big confrontations between nation's elite, which was predominantly out on the East Coast, and poorer places out to the west, particularly Pennsylvania, parts of Western Virginia, and it came down to the following. So the tax was imposed, and it was called excise tax on alcohol and spirits. And the alcohol and spirits tax was implemented on the production. The rich folks, so folks like George Washington, right, who had huge distilleries, who had established production, they could pass it on to the clients, they could pass it on to the customers, so they didn't feel as much pressure as the poorer, much more poorer people out to the west. And out to the west, it wasn't only a means to get drunk, if you will. It wasn't a means to spend some pastime, but it was actually used as a cash. So it was more like a tax on a cash system, because it was a system of barter where many farmers who were producing the cash crops, they were pretty much doing distilling and using it as a means of exchange. So to cut the long story short, eventually the government came down hard. It sent out troops. All negotiations failed, but at the same time, there were only 2 people convicted of treason, something like 30 who were arrested, and all of them were pardoned by President Washington. So pretty much it ended as a no winner, no loser type of situation. But then it was repealed, and it was repealed through the political means by electing Thomas Jefferson, and then it was reimposed again. So this is how it started. right? Now going interestingly, one of the complaints that the folks on the frontier were talking about, the white settlers, they were making, was the fact that the government was collecting taxes, but it wasn't doing enough to protect them, provide them with protection against Indians, right? And it's a very interesting situation, because first of all, you expect, if you pay the government, you expect some sort of protection. And back then, the government was fragile. All the Indians, they were treated part as each tribe is a separate nation. So you were on the frontier, you were in a way of constant war. And if you like history, if you particularly United States history, during the early revolutionary era, I would highly recommend watching this guy. He's a professor, Colin Holloway, and he did a lecture. Here is a link about what truly was going on out in the West during the time when the excise tax was imposed, because white settlers didn't come on empty land. White settlers they were coming on already occupied land by Indians, right? Those Indians were at the time operating under protectorate of French, and when the British government came in, this was just prior to the revolution. When the British came in, right, they provided different treatment to than the French. Particularly, they tended to speak from the vantage point of power, while French were trying to negotiate, provide gifts, etc., being more diplomatic, if you will. So in other words, and he talks about the Americans as an independent nation when nation's elite decided to take over. When nations elite decided to take over and provide for their own territories, he pretty much makes an argument, and he is talking about the Thomas that Clark trip, which Thomas Jefferson sponsored. He said pretty much that Americans were acting in the same way. The early American colonists were acting in the same way as the British. So the confrontation was, the root cause of confrontation was the behavior of the settlers themselves. So if you're interested, you can see that. And another thing, before we dive into how it relates to customs, is to point out that many of us who go to high school, go through the education, or the standard education of the United States, we are usually taught that, okay, we all probably heard about the Boston Tea Party, right? And we all probably heard how it was a revolt against taxes. Yes, in a way, the tea had to do something with it. But there is another guy, and that guy, let me pull his book up. So he's written a book. And it's called History of the World in 6 Glasses, right? And Tom Sandage, and he makes an argument, and he talks about drinks in general. He devoted a lot of stuff to the distilled spirits in particular, and he mentions that, all right, so a lot of revolutionary movement was in part due to the production of alcohol itself, because a lot of stuff, especially a lot of folks, especially some in places like Boston, New York, and up and down the coast, what they were doing is they were engaged in production of rum. It wasn't whiskey, it was rum that was prevalent in the early days of the Republic. But and this is how they got their head start. To produce rum, they require molasses, right? And molasses is kind of like it's a sugar-like substance, kind of like a syrup, which is produced from the sugar cane. And to get the sugar cane, they had to import it sometimes illegally from the British colonies and French colonies down in Caribbean, and that participated in a conflict because British Crown wanted to take part of the revenues in those business activities. So this book pretty much argues that alcohol and the production of distilled spirits had had played a very important role, if not the important role, as the revolt in the form of the Tea or Boston Tea Party. All right, so that's about distilled spirits. So let's forward to the nowadays, and let's see what type of stuff we have to do in order to get the distilled spirit into the country legally. So pretty much once you import alcohol product, and distilled spirit doesn't include stuff you consume, it also includes stuff such as perfumes and other things as we'll see, but it all starts at the entry, right? Well, at the time the merchandise hits the border, you have to pay duty. So this is a reproduction of entry summary CBP form 7501. This is the portion where you pay, and it's a little bit increased. And this is the portion where you declare your duty as well as tax. And as you can see, there is one column for duties and for taxes, with taxes providing a special box for taxes, giving them a separate, distinct treatment. All right. So what type of excise taxes or what type of liability does arise from the importation of products? Or put it in other words, what type of products you have to pay taxes on in addition to duty in order to get the product illegally and not having it treated as a contraband, for example. Generally speaking, for the customs license broker exam purposes, there is pretty much one type that has been tested and probably will be tested again, and it's called federal excise tax. Federal excise tax is assessed on alcohol products, beer, wine, distilled spirits, perfumes, and tobacco products as well. Cigars, cigarettes, chewing, pipe tobacco, cigarette papers, and tubes, right? But for the folks that are in the field of compliance, this is probably will be tested. It hasn't been tested so much. Another huge area which one needs to be mindful of is the excise tax on ozone-depleting chemicals. It's that bad stuff like CFC, chlorofluorocarbons, that kill our ozone layer, against which Congress has passed numerous laws, which were outlawed in the United States. Well, here's the thing. Congress outlawed ozone-depleting chemicals in the United States, but those chemicals were not outlawed in other parts of the world. So, what is the way for the Congress to curb the production and how should I say it more nicely? Save our environment, right? Save our ozone layer. Well, one way is to impose the excise tax on the products with which those ozone-depleting chemicals were used, and this is this can be called environmental tax. And in part, let me share the publication. So, publication 510. It deals with a discourse about the taxes, right? About the taxes which were which came out as ozone depleting rise out of ozone depleting chemical use, right? So use of imported products, right? So first of all, the liability arises from the use. So liability also arises from the sale. So once you bring in the product, the taxable event may happen. The taxable event occurs when tax is imposed on ODC, ozone depleting chemical, when it is first, buzzwords, used or sold in by the manufacturer or importer, right? So importer is a key here because we're dealing with importation of merchandise. Also keep in mind a lot of federal agencies, a lot of regulatory agencies, they define, as we shall discuss shortly in the context of Toxic Substances Control Act, federal agencies define manufacturing event and to be equivalent to the importing event. So act of one thing is tantamount to the act of another thing. All right, so the manufacturer or importer is liable for tax. So once the taxable event happens, and taxable event is either use or sale. So, for example, sale is easy part, right? So let's say it hits this is a border, right? And the merchandise hits the border, and once it hits the border, it is being resold to someone else. So here is the importer of record, right? The party responsible for the duties, taxes, and all other compliance issues. And importer of record, what it does is, if it sells it at the border or around the time when the merchandise hits the border, the liability arises because it sold the product, right? So it wouldn't be the buyer, right? But it would be the importer of record who would need to who would be responsible for payment of taxes. Another point, which is more interesting, I think, is the use. So what's the deal with the use, right? First we must know that entry can be treated as use. It can be treated as an election. At the election, because the importer may choose to treat an entry of the product in the United States as the use of the product. In other words, it's a term of art. Let's look at the definition of use. You use an imported product if you put into the service or trade in a trade or business, or for the production in income, or use in the making of an article, including incorporation into the article. In other words, it pretty much encompasses almost anything you do with the stuff, right? So because the rule is so broad, I think it's better to focus on the exception, which is the second sentence of the paragraph, which includes the loss, destruction, packaging, repackaging, warehousing, or repair of imported product is not considered use of that product. So if you engage in any activities, let's say you imported product, let's say you're a big retailer, and you import the product, and you are gonna import it, and because it's a seasonal, you put it for the warehousing, and then you're gonna sell it. You plan to sell it later. Let's say Halloween stuff, right? You import it in the summer, you store it in the warehouse. You are not selling it yet. This is just warehousing, right? So okay, it's warehousing. The use of the product has not yet happened. So that may be justified not to pay tax on ODC or ozone depleting chemical. Now, why am I spending so much time about this stuff? Because once we look at the table, the table listing what type of products are covered by ozone depleting chemical tax, it will for many folks, at least with whom I've spoken, who didn't come across it, it would raise their eyebrows. So let's take a look. Remember we talked about CFR, Code of Federal Regulation. So here, this is IRS section. So most of us are tested on section 19 CFR, right? Section 26, not section, the title 19, I'm sorry. But title 26 deals with Internal Revenue Service, IRS, right? This is where they publish all the rules, including the stuff that you have to declare on annual basis. At least most of us have to declare. And at the end of this particular rule, they provide a table where they list different products. Let's check it out. So you have dehumidifiers, chillers, refrigerators, freezers, right? So this stuff, this rule can be potentially applicable to department stores, right? Which import refrigerators.